everyone, I am Riza Aileen Buralok and today I will discuss the ethical and social consideration in testing, which is about the confidentiality. First, let us define what is confidentiality. So, confidentiality is a part of the ethical guidelines of psychologists and means that information between a patient and a therapist cannot be shared with anyone. So, this applies to patients and any health professional, including doctors and nurses. So, there are only a few exceptions to confidentiality, such as the concept of duty to warn, which means that confidentiality can be broken if the patient is a threat to themselves, such as being suicidal, or others, like threatening to harm another person. Psychologists safeguard the confidentiality of information obtained during the provision of psychological services. So we have here recording, accessing, storage, dissemination, and disposal. So they also take reasonable steps to protect the confidentiality of information. So psychologists protect the privacy of data they collect while providing psychological services. So in light of their organizational and legal obligations, so psychologists include provisions to protect privacy when gathering, recording, accessing, storing, disseminating, and discarding the information, and also they take reasonable precautions to preserve information's confidentiality when they leave a particular workplace or stop offering psychological services. So next, indicate the assessed limits to confidentiality. So it is the ethical duty of the psychologist to explain the boundaries of confidentiality to people being assessed when conducting psychological tests. So, the written consent of the client for the distribution of the findings, where relevant, is an essential component of an informed consent. Safeguarding the confidentiality of psychological assessment data. So, psychologists are responsible for safeguarding the confidentiality of psychological assessment data. So, at the beginning of their employment in an organization, psychologists discuss with their employer the ethical obligation for the confidentiality of the psychological evaluation data. So, psychologists who are working in multidisciplinary teams clarify with their colleagues the ethical requirement for confidentiality of psychological assessment data, also the type and extent of information that will be shared, and lastly, how that information sharing will take place. Have here they inform clients about how their personal information will be used and to whom it may be disclosed. So prior to beginning the provision of psychological services, psychologists who work for companies where it is necessary to exchange files and data with other specialists make sure that clients are aware of this obligation. So there are enforceable clauses in the Privacy Acts relating to the privacy of individual personal information. So for instance, uh, psychologists are expected to disclose to clients how and to whom their personal information will be used. Psychologists additionally maintain the privacy of client information by only disclosing the data that is necessary for the psychological service to be provided. So, psychologists are aware of the inappropriate requests from other professionals for client assessment records, and they refuse to comply if doing so would violate the confidentiality or the Privacy Act's restrictions. So, lastly, we have here the ensure that clients are aware of this requirement prior to commencing the provision of a psychological services. So, depending on the psychologist's professional environment, the release of test findings to clients may be requested under privacy laws or the Freedom of Information Act. So, each system's appropriate authority can provide information on the requirements for applications and the justifications for document releases. So, test documents may be considered exempt documents if disclosing them would be in the public's best interest and would disprove the use um, first disprove the usefulness of the exam or test in psychology practice. Uh, Also make it difficult for psychologists to adequately carry out their duties, and if it violates the contractual agreements that psychologists sign to get test material. So when feasible, clients should be informed of this obligation. So if a psychologist departs a multidisciplinary context and is not replaced by another psychologist, ownership of this data should be transferred to uh, another designated psychologist. So these duties of health service providers takes place in the event of practice transfer or closure, as well as the death of the said health service provider. So that would be all for my report. Here is my reference. So thank you so much for listening.